Something shifted last week that escaped most people's attention. It wasn't a summit or a policy speech. It was a border quietly closing to something no one considers until it becomes their problem. And let me tell you, when I first came across this story, I had to read it twice because the implications are far more significant than the headline suggests. We're talking about garbage, yes, but we're really talking about trust, leverage, and what happens when a relationship between two nations begins to fracture in ways that most citizens won't notice until the consequences arrive at their doorstep. Stay with me on this one, because by the end, you'll understand why a decision about waste could reshape North American relations for years to come. For decades, the United States has shipped its refuse north, literally, not symbolically. Truckloads crossing into Canada daily, processed in facilities that American municipalities chose not to construct domestically. This arrangement functioned precisely because it remained unexamined. Nobody talked about it at dinner parties. No politicians campaigned on it. It simply worked in the background, invisible to everyone except the logistics companies and municipal officials who managed the contracts. But here's what I find fascinating about these kinds of arrangements. They work beautifully until someone decides they don't want to play along anymore. And that's exactly what happened when Mark Carney announced Canada would halt American waste imports. Washington's reaction leaned more toward puzzlement than concern. How could rejecting garbage constitute meaningful policy? Yet for those of us familiar with how nations express displeasure without open conflict, this decision carries unmistakable significance. This isn't about refuse. It's about confidence. And confidence withdrawn doesn't return on demand. Let me walk you through what occurred, why it matters, and what it illuminates about a relationship many Americans believed would endure regardless of how much strain was applied to it. Beneath this ostensibly mundane decision lies a deeper narrative about power dynamics when one party loses faith in the other's commitment to agreements. Ottawa's official statement appeared straightforward enough. Canada cited environmental priorities, capacity constraints, and the need to strengthen domestic waste infrastructure. Each rationale stands defensible independently. But I've been covering international affairs long enough to know that timing in statecraft is never coincidental. This decision arrived precisely when bilateral relations had deteriorated into sustained tension, when trade threats and territorial language from Washington had transformed cooperation from partnership into something that felt more like submission. You may wonder why refuse matters in international relations at all. Understanding requires thinking about infrastructure the way governments do. Waste isn't simply discarded material. It represents a logistical challenge every modern economy must address. Cities generate millions of tons annually. Processing demands land, technology, regulatory frameworks, and political resolve. When a city or state lacks processing capacity, it exports the problem. For years, Canada accepted that problem for compensation. What changed wasn't the waste itself. What changed was one country's willingness to continue accommodating another that had ceased behaving like a dependable partner. In geopolitics, minor decisions often carry disproportionate symbolic weight. Refusing waste imports won't destabilize the American economy overnight, but it signals Ottawa's readiness to inconvenience Washington in ways that compound over time. And I want you to understand something crucial here. Accumulation builds leverage. Consider the position facing American municipalities right now. Cities that outsourced waste management suddenly confront logistical emergencies. Landfills never built because Canadian capacity existed must now be reconsidered. Contracts assuming cross-border access require renegotiation. All of this against a backdrop of strained municipal budgets and environmental opposition to new disposal sites. The problem doesn't vanish because the border closed. It simply returns home. This reveals an institutional dimension that most coverage has missed entirely. Governments don't make such decisions impulsively. Canada's action was coordinated across multiple agencies, aligned with broader environmental commitments, and timed for maximum political resonance. It was designed to register without theatrics. That restraint itself proves revealing. Ottawa didn't convene press conferences denouncing American waste. It simply altered the rules and allowed consequences to speak for themselves. For the average observer, this might seem like a minor footnote in the larger continental relationship. But I want you to step back with me and see a different picture emerging. A country that once absorbed American externalities without complaint now asserts boundaries, and boundaries once established tend to expand rather than contract. What begins with garbage may extend to energy, water, and regulatory cooperation in sectors. American industry depends on far more than commonly recognized. I keep returning to a question that has shaped my analysis in recent years. What happens when a nation built on assumptions of global accommodation discovers accommodation has limits? The United States has operated for generations believing its size and influence guaranteed neighbor cooperation. That belief wasn't entirely mistaken, but it was incomplete. Cooperation isn't automatic. It requires maintenance through behavior that inspires confidence rather than anxiety. The decision to close borders to American waste didn't emerge from a single grievance. It accumulated from signals suggesting Washington no longer viewed Canada as a partner deserving respect, trade threats delivered without warning, territorial rhetoric about annexation that some officials treated as humor but landed in Ottawa as something far graver, tariff announcements disrupting industries built on decades of integrated supply chains. Each action individually might have been absorbed. Together they formed a pattern demanding response. And I think this is where we need to be honest about the situation. What makes this moment significant isn't the specific commodity involved. It's the precedent being established. Canada is demonstrating it possesses economic pressure tools that don't require dramatic confrontation. It can simply withdraw cooperation in areas where American systems had come to depend on Canadian willingness. And withdrawal, unlike tariffs, doesn't invite immediate retaliation. It simply forces the other side to solve problems they had previously outsourced. You might question whether this represents a proportionate response. That question assumes a proportionality framework that may no longer apply. When one country repeatedly signals it views another as subordinate, the subordinate eventually decides compliance costs exceed resistance costs. Canada appears to have crossed that threshold, and once crossed, it proves difficult to reverse. I've spoken with people in the logistics industry this week, and the practical consequences for American communities are already surfacing in ways that will only intensify. Waste management companies that built business models around Canadian access are scrambling for alternatives. Municipal governments face budget shortfalls as disposal costs rise unexpectedly. Environmental activists who long opposed new landfill construction now face uncomfortable choices between their principles and the reality that refuse must go somewhere. None of these pressures will collapse the system overnight, but they will accumulate, and accumulation is where real impact lies. Let me be clear about what I'm not claiming here. This isn't a story about Canadian virtue versus American vice. Both countries pursue their interests. Both leverage their positions when it serves them. What distinguishes this moment is the asymmetry of expectations. Washington assumed pressure would yield compliance. Ottawa decided compliance without reciprocity was no longer acceptable. That divergence of assumptions produced the current situation. You might recognize a similar dynamic in your own life if you think about it. Relationships endure when both parties feel respected. When one consistently takes more than it gives, the other eventually withdraws. Nations follow the same logic, just on longer timelines and with greater complexity. Canada didn't spontaneously decide to punish the United States. It arrived at this conclusion after years of signals suggesting the relationship had become fundamentally unbalanced. The deeper institutional lesson concerns the nature of interdependence itself. For decades, economists and policymakers celebrated North American economic integration as a global model. Supply chains crossed borders seamlessly. Energy flowed bidirectionally. Waste was processed wherever capacity existed. This integration was genuine and generated real benefits for citizens on both sides of the border. But integration also creates vulnerability, and this is the part that advocates of integration often minimize. When one party begins treating the relationship as leverage rather than partnership, the other discovers just how exposed they've become. What Ottawa has done isn't hostile in the traditional sense, it's self-protective. By reducing dependence on American goodwill, Canada positions itself to weather future shocks without being forced into concessions it finds unacceptable. This logic won't remain confined to waste management, and that's what I want you to understand as we continue. It will extend to energy exports, critical minerals, and water resources American states increasingly depend on. Each sector where Canada reduces exposure becomes a sector where American leverage diminishes accordingly. The human dimension deserves attention as well, because it's easy to lose sight of individual lives when discussing policy in abstract terms. Behind every policy decision are workers whose livelihoods depend on stable arrangements. Truck drivers who transported waste across borders face uncertain futures through no fault of their own. Canadian landfill operators who built capacity for American imports must find new revenue streams. American municipal employees who manage these contracts are scrambling for alternatives that may not exist. These aren't abstract consequences. They're disruptions to real lives caused ultimately by breakdown in the assumptions governing cross-border cooperation. I suspect many of you haven't thought much about where your garbage goes after you place it at the curb. That inattention is understandable. Modern life insulates us from the logistics of consumption. We place bags at curbs and they disappear as if by magic. But that disappearance requires infrastructure, and infrastructure requires relationships. When those relationships fracture, consequences eventually reach the curb itself. Prices rise, services strain, and citizens begin noticing what they previously took for granted. What strikes me most about this episode is how little fanfare accompanied it. Canada didn't declare economic war. It didn't summon ambassadors or issue ultimatums. It simply adjusted policy and allowed the adjustment to speak for itself. This restraint is strategic, and I want you to recognize it as such. Dramatic gestures invite dramatic responses. Quiet adjustments force the other side to absorb costs without clear retaliation targets. Washington cannot easily impose tariffs on Canadian refusal to accept garbage. It can only address consequences, and addressing consequences takes time and resources. The broader pattern this reveals will define North American relations for years to come. Canada has learned it possesses more leverage than it previously exercised. The United States has discovered that leverage it assumed permanent can erode when partners lose confidence in its reliability. Both countries must now navigate a relationship where old assumptions no longer hold. That navigation will be uncomfortable for everyone involved. For those following these dynamics closely, the question isn't whether more adjustments will come, but when and in what sectors. Energy is an obvious candidate that keeps me up at night thinking about implications. Canada supplies significant portions of American oil and natural gas. Disruptions there would be felt immediately and acutely across the economy. Critical minerals necessary for technology and defense represent another area where Canadian cooperation cannot be assumed going forward. Water, particularly for agricultural states depending on shared watersheds, presents yet another vulnerability that rarely makes headlines but matters enormously. None of these areas will be weaponized casually, but all now exist within a framework where cooperation is conditional rather than guaranteed. I want to leave you with a reflection on what this means for national sovereignty because I think it illuminates something important about power in the modern world. The United States has long understood sovereignty as the ability to act without constraint from external powers. But sovereignty in an interconnected world operates differently than it did a century ago. It's not merely freedom to act, it's the capacity to absorb consequences of those actions. When a country discovers its actions have consequences it cannot easily manage, its effective sovereignty diminishes regardless of military strength or economic size. Canada, by asserting boundaries, has expanded its own sovereignty while constraining that of its neighbor. This isn't aggression in any conventional sense. It's natural rebalancing when one party overreaches and the other pushes back. The garbage accumulating at American borders is more than a logistical problem to be solved by consultants and contractors. It's a symbol of a relationship under strain. And symbols in politics have a way of becoming realities that shape future decisions. The question now is whether Washington will interpret this moment as a signal to recalibrate its approach or as provocation requiring escalation. History suggests the answer will depend less on rational calculation than on political incentives facing decision makers. And those incentives presently don't favor restraint. As I consider the months ahead, I find myself cautiously pessimistic about where this trajectory leads. The patterns that produce this moment show no signs of reversing. Rhetoric from Washington continues treating Canada as something less than a sovereign, equal, deserving of respect. Responses from Ottawa continue asserting boundaries that were previously implicit. Each cycle of action and reaction moves both countries further from the integration that once seemed permanent. That movement isn't inevitable, but reversing it would require behavioral changes neither side currently appears willing to make. There's another dimension to this story that deserves exploration before we conclude. The timing of Canada's decision coincided with a broader reassessment of continental relationships extending far beyond waste management. Mark Carney, whose central banking background gave him unusual perspective on economic interdependence, understood something many political leaders overlook entirely. Financial systems and physical infrastructure are connected in ways that become visible only when stress is applied. Garbage is infrastructure. Energy is infrastructure. Water is infrastructure. And infrastructure, once taken for granted, becomes a source of leverage when one party decides to assert control over it. The reaction from American industry associations has been revealing to watch unfold. Initial dismissiveness gave way to concern as implications became clear. Companies that built logistics networks assuming permanent Canadian access now face the prospect of redesigning those networks entirely. The costs aren't trivial. Billions in infrastructure investments were predicated on assumptions that no longer hold. And investors watching these developments are beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what other assumptions might prove equally fragile. For workers in the waste management sector specifically, uncertainty is acute. Jobs that seem secure now depend on political negotiations no individual can influence. Families that built lives around stable employment face disruption through no fault of their own. This human cost is easily overlooked when discussing policy in abstract terms, but it's real and it will shape political pressures in both countries going forward. The environmental dimension adds another layer of complexity that I find fascinating from a strategic perspective. Canada's stated rationale emphasized sustainability and domestic capacity building. These are legitimate goals that resonate with Canadian voters increasingly concerned about environmental degradation. But they also serve a strategic purpose that shouldn't be overlooked. By framing the decision in environmental terms, Ottawa makes it difficult for Washington to characterize the move as purely punitive. Critics who might otherwise condemn Canadian protectionism find themselves in the awkward position of arguing against environmental protection. The framing is deliberate and effective. American environmental groups face a peculiar dilemma as a result. Many have long opposed waste export as environmental colonialism, shifting consumption burdens onto communities bearing none of its benefits. By that logic, Canada's decision should be celebrated. Yet the immediate consequence is increased pressure to site new landfills in American communities lacking political power to resist. Environmental justice concerns don't disappear when borders close. They simply relocate. And relocation often means communities least equipped to fight back become repositories for problems. Wealthier communities refuse to solve themselves. I want to draw your attention to the institutional architecture that made this decision possible, because it reveals something important about governance. Canada's federal system gives significant authority to provinces over environmental policy, but the decision to restrict waste imports required coordination across multiple government levels, alignment between environmental ministries and trade officials, and careful legal review ensuring compliance with international obligations. This coordination didn't happen overnight. It was the product of planning beginning long before any public announcement was made. When you see a policy emerge fully formed like this one, you can be certain extensive preparation preceded it. The contrast with American policymaking is instructive. Where Ottawa moved methodically and strategically, Washington has often moved impulsively and without apparent consideration of downstream consequences. Tariffs announced via social media. Trade policies reversed within weeks of implementation. Threats issued without apparent consideration of how partners might respond. This unpredictability pattern has real costs that compound over time. It makes planning difficult for businesses on both sides of the border. It creates uncertainty that discourages investment. And it signals to partners that commitments made today may not survive tomorrow. Canada's decision can be understood partly as response to that unpredictability. By reducing dependence on American cooperation, Ottawa insulates itself from consequences of American volatility. The question of whether this represents permanent shift or temporary adjustment remains open, and I think reasonable people can disagree about the answer. Some observers believe a change in American political leadership would restore the relationship to its previous equilibrium. Others argue the damage runs deeper, that trust once broken requires years to rebuild regardless of who occupies the White House. My own view falls closer to the latter assessment. Institutions have memories. The officials and business leaders who navigated this crisis will carry those memories into future negotiations. The models they build will incorporate assumptions about American reliability that didn't exist a decade ago. Those assumptions, once embedded in planning processes, prove remarkably persistent even when political circumstances change. There's a lesson here for those of you who may not follow international trade closely, but feel consequences in your daily lives nonetheless. The price of goods you purchase, the availability of services you rely on, the stability of employment in your community, all of these depend on relationships between nations most citizens never think about. When those relationships strain, effects eventually reach you, not as headlines about diplomatic tensions, but as higher costs, reduced choices, and opportunities that quietly disappear before you even knew they existed. The connection between a border closing to garbage and your household budget may seem abstract, but abstractions have a way of becoming concrete when they accumulate. I've spent years watching how nations respond when expectations are violated. The pattern is remarkably consistent. First comes denial, the assumption that the violation is temporary and will self-correct. Then comes frustration as consequences become undeniable. Finally comes adaptation, often reluctant, as institutions reshape themselves to accommodate new reality. The United States appears somewhere between the first and second stages currently. Canada has already moved to the third. That asymmetry will define the relationship for years to come and will shape options available to policymakers on both sides. What happens next depends on choices not yet made. Washington could interpret Canada's decision as a wake-up call, an invitation to rebuild trust through more predictable and respectful behavior. Or it could interpret the decision as provocation requiring escalation. The incentives facing American policymakers don't clearly favor either response. Domestic political pressures pull in multiple directions simultaneously, and in that ambiguity lies both danger and opportunity. For Canadian policymakers, the challenge is different but equally complex. Having asserted boundaries, they must now decide how far to extend them. Each additional sector where cooperation is withdrawn increases Canadian leverage, but also increases the risk of escalation that serves neither country's interests. Finding the balance between self-protection and provocation requires judgment that cannot be reduced to formula. Ottawa has shown it possesses the will to act. The question is whether it possesses the wisdom to know when action becomes counterproductive. As I bring this analysis to a close, I want to return to the image with which we began. Garbage accumulating because a border closed. It's not a dramatic image. There are no explosions, no troops, no declarations of war, just trucks turned back and waste that must now find somewhere else to go. But in that mundane reality lies a truth about how power operates in the 21st century. It operates through infrastructure, through logistics, through the countless arrangements that make modern life possible. When those arrangements fail, the failure is quiet but pervasive. And quiet failures, precisely because they lack drama, often escape the attention they deserve. If you remember nothing else from this discussion, remember that relationships between nations are not static. They require maintenance. They require behavior that inspires confidence. And when that maintenance fails, consequences arrive not as crises, but as inconveniences that accumulate until they can no longer be ignored. The garbage at the border is such an inconvenience. It will be solved eventually, but the conditions that produced it will persist. And those conditions, more than any single policy decision, will determine what kind of continent North America becomes in the decades ahead. The world rewards attention to detail, and detail is often where the most important stories hide. Stay attentive to the quiet shifts. They're often the ones that matter most.